The U.S. American author and thinker David Thoreau lived on a pond near Concord, Massachusetts. How did I do? If you're from Massachusetts, let me know how close I was there. He did so for a couple of years to, well, as we say now, live off the grid. But there was one part of the grid that Thoreau couldn't avoid, and that was in the winter, hundreds of ice workers showing up to take off enormous blocks of ice from the pond for sale in other places in the U.S. and, well, around the world. This is the story of the beginning and end of one of the United States of America's biggest trade industries of the 19th century and how it melted away. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet. Thanks for joining me. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. For people in temperate and tropical places, ice is a luxury. Well, that's because in temperate places that get ice and snow, ice is more of an inconvenience of the winter and sorely needed in the summer, especially in continental climates and other related subtropical climates that get really hot in the summer. And for tropical locations, there may be no ice anywhere near to be found. So when ice first arrived in those places as part of a big marketing scheme to, sell more ice, it caught on. And all of a sudden, cool drinks and flavored ice were popular. The history of getting ice and using it for drinks and food is really, really, really old. And there were really two ways of going about this. In those temperate climates where there was something nearby, maybe mountains or some sort of icy area where snow and ice could be gotten and brought to areas that didn't really see snow and ice, that was what happened. And we see that in a lot of places around the world that have snow and ice. In the places that don't have snow and ice, of course, that didn't happen. Those are the places I'm talking about where ice was really introduced from the 19th century ice trade. And the most interesting, I think, one of the most interesting ways of creating that ice, actually, you can still see the evidence for it in places like Iran. As long as 2,400 years ago, these structures and basically ice-making plants were built in hot and cold desert climates in that region. And it's those desert climates that were critical for the existence of these ice houses. And the reason these ice houses, these ice-producing operations in ancient Persia worked and still work is because of the lack of humidity in the desert. Because in terms of the temperature, that can rely on the fact that the temperature in the desert drops at night, and that's where you can get freezing temperatures in the desert. And then you also need for this process of making ice, a very important element of it is the loss of heat through radiation. So radiation is the thing that, warms the earth when the sun shines on it. And that radiation can be blocked through these big shade walls that shade the pond where the ice is made in these ancient Persian structures. But it's the radiation of the heat from the water that is it needs to be allowed to go into the atmosphere, into the sky. And the thing that allows for that is that there's not water, a lot of water in the air. So that makes it, because that water, if there were water in the air there in the desert, then that water would reflect the radiation back into the pond. And that's why there is that added element, which where a lot of heat radiates off of the water. And so that is an element that it's critical to be in that desert climate. And that's why there are these ice houses in those, specifically those desert climates, and they work well. It is also why, just in terms of, you think about evaporation. Obviously, evaporation is also an important element of this. You can't, if the air is too humid, then the water is not going to evaporate into the air, and then so the through an evaporative process, the heat that is in the water can't evaporate in the air. And that's why evaporative cooling systems don't work so super well in places that are humid. Evaporative cooling is what we do when we sweat. And it's why when you sweat in the desert, you kind of your skin is dry because it's evaporating. And that is allowing the cooling process to work really efficiently. And sometimes without you noticing it, which could be dangerous because you're losing a lot of water. On the other hand, if you're in a really humid climate, you'll notice that in the heat of a humid summer day, everything stays wet, which doesn't allow for the evaporative cooling that sweating does for us. Now, when the ice is made in the ice house, it gets put into these conical shaped structures that are kind of like beehive shaped domes that have a hole at the top and are usually dug a little bit into the ground. And those are the ice houses where the ice can be stored. And that is important because in our ice trade of the 19th century story, the ice house was critical for the storage of ice being shipped around the world. And the key to the ice house, as was discovered, was not so much digging deep, which happened in some places in more northerly climes. There was the idea that you just dig down deep and the temperature will be cooler. So but that's not really what you necessarily need to keep ice. Ice. So the key here is that ventilation part is critical, and the ventilation happens through that top of the ice house, because you don't want the hot air that is being produced to stay and heat the ice, but also you don't want the ice to melt because of contact with water. So all of these ice houses always have some form of insulation for the ice. So the ice might be packed in sawdust, or it might be packed in straw. So the combination of having a little bit of a way to prevent the water to melt the ice. Because if you drop ice in a glass of water, what do you have after a few minutes? You have, a glass of water. You don't have any more ice. And so that's why the idea of making sure that the ice stays dry, not dry ice, that's a whole different story, but that the ice stays as dry as possible, to make sure that you're not basically melting the ice with the water. Usually there's some sort of insulation that keeps the cold in, prevents it from melting with into water and then melting the ice even further. So you'll see this today. So, for example, in this very day, there is a place in New Hampshire, the state of New Hampshire, in the United States, that still has an ice house. They cut ice from the lake when it freezes, and they bring the ice into the ice house for the summer. And it's a summer camp. You can rent a cabin, and the cabins have ice boxes, real ice boxes, not metaphorical ice boxes, because some people still call refrigerators ice boxes out there. And this is the original way that the ice box worked and the refrigerator worked, is that you have a piece of a very large chunk of ice that is put in a cabinet above the refrigerator unit, and that cools the inside part of the refrigerator, which is insulated with some of the same insulation that is insulating the ice, interestingly, originally, and has a, say, tin lining and so forth. And those ice boxes are still operational at this camp in New Hampshire, where you can rent a cabin and experience the joys of having ice delivered to you. And the ice there is stored in an ice house that apparently goes maybe 3 feet or so down into the ground, and then with there's sawdust that is that the ice is packed in, and that keeps it insulated, so that we're preventing the melting, so that the water doesn't melt the ice further. And that is the way that it works, and it works really, really well. And that was true in the 19th century. And the person who really, there was a single person who really drove this whole industry through their own business ventures, and that person is named Frederick Tudor. And because if you're familiar with the history of England and the Tudor kings, you will not be surprised that Henry Tudor got the nickname the Ice King. And Henry Tudor was operating in Boston, and that's why one of the ponds that his ice men, as they were called back then, collected ice from in the winter was Walden Pond, outside of Concord, Massachusetts, where David Thoreau was trying to get off the grid. Now, Tudor was extremely aggressive in his marketing of ice and in his shipping of ice. And this was the big thing for him, was that he was cutting so much ice out of the ponds in Massachusetts, also, I believe, further afield in Maine and other places. So what did he start to do? He started to say, you know what? I need to build ice houses in places like Martinique, or in Havana, or in what was then called Calcutta, today's Kolkata, and sell ice to people there to have refreshing ice drinks in the warm climates of those places, which also are places where there's no access to snow or ice remotely. And so that was the beginning of what became in the United States one of the biggest trades of all. And at some point, millions of tons of ice were being exported from the United States around the world, as far as Hong Kong. By some estimates, it was second only to the U.S.'s global cotton trade. And that created a big demand for everything cool. And it also changed the way that perishable goods could be shipped. And it also preserved goods that enabled them to be shipped for long distances. And so there were things like the creation of rail cars that would have blocks of ice that would cool the interior of the car, refrigerating it, so that things like beef from the stockyards of Chicago and other places could be shipped around the country. Now, there was something about shipping ice long distances that led to big losses, as you might imagine. So on a clipper ship from Boston to, say, what is now India, the losses were tremendous. About 50% of the ice would be lost by melting, because clipper ships are wonderful fast ships, but not exactly designed to store ice. But even with that, the profits were enormous. And so even with a 50% loss of cargo, there were still massive profits on this ice. Things like apples, which were never known to a lot of places because they didn't grow there, could be sent from the U.S. apple growers to destinations across the ocean or down the ocean without rotting. And that made for a big change in what could be available when and where. And also, it created the market for things like ices and iced drinks, and a lot of places around the world where these things were unknown before that point, they became part of local traditions. And that whole eating of ice, that goes back a long way as well. But that was either the luxury of some place where ice could be made or gotten from nearby mountains and brought down to more temperate climes. Now ice was becoming available everywhere. And then something happened in 1914 that resulted in the beginning of the end for the ice trade. In fact, today, the ice trade is very limited because of an invention, well, a version of an invention that happened in 1914. And that was the invention of a type of refrigerator, and the idea of the principles behind refrigeration, which involve a heat pump, which we won't go into too many details about that today. But the principle of refrigeration was known for a long time, since the 18th century. But the actual contained unit that would be both safe, because there were commercial refrigerators that were using gases and liquids that were just not safe for domestic use. But the creation of a safe way to cool the inside of a refrigerator and even produce a part of it that created ice changed the game completely. A guy in Chicago named Fred W. Wolf Jr. created the domestic electric refrigerator, which went by the acronym DOMELRE, which, from the ads, it's not clear whether this is Dom-El-Re or Dom-El-Re. Well, if you know, let me know in the comments. And even though it wasn't cheap, that refrigerator sold like hotcakes, no pun intended. And its original price was something around what today would be $25,000. But within a couple of years, it was down to just several $1,000s. And then by the 1920s, General Electric and others had gotten into the business in ways that had lowered the price even further. And by the 1950s, the ice trade in major cities around the country, which had been in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s, as I said, the massively large industry was pretty much defunct. So in the course of 144 years or so, 150 years, a trade began and ended. And it all started with the Ice King, of Boston, Frederick Tudor, and his idea to ship ice around the world. Well, why don't we ask the cards for their stone cold advice to us about our work and lives? All right, cards, let's go. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us some things. It's card 19. It's only desperation if you have no actual strategy. Always act in line with an empowered plan that advances your progress towards your goals. The exact same action can often be perceived as either desperate or strategic, depending on whether it's part of a plan or not. So, think about a decision you're making right now. What would be the desperate thing to do, and what would be the empowered thing to do? And I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.